So here we are back to talk about classical era empires. I will endeavor to try to not say as much as I did in my last two videos. Although you have to understand that it's not as easy to talk to an iPad with a blank screen as it is to talk to a whole classroom of students. So please forgive my ums. I'm doing the best that I can, and onward we go. So today's topic is the Han Dynasty, and if you're in class, then you probably got these notes. If you weren't, then sit back and enjoy the ride. Our topic today is the Han Dynasty, as I mentioned, and our essential question is the ongoing question for this unit, which is how are empires formed and maintained. And that goes to our compelling question of the entire unit, which is, what empowers empires? So go ahead and create your Cornell Notes template, as you can see here. And you're going to take the notes in this section here, notes. And feel free to put any questions that you may have about this discussion or my slides in the left-hand column. That's what it's used for. Excellent. So the Han Dynasty, as you can see, the dates are 206 BC to 220 CE. Again, the specifics are not exactly important. You should have a sense of about 200 BC to 200 CE. That'll give you a good sense of when the Han Dynasty existed. Liu Bang is the establisher of this new dynasty, and it's not that he was the initial leader of rebellions against the Qing dynasty. He sort of came in toward the end. And that's the thing with the dynastic cycle and the mandate of heaven. It's the one person who's able to then seize control of the rebellions that are occurring throughout China and create peace and order. They claim the new mandate. And so that's Liu Bang. He did not start the rebellions, but he sort of ended them, if you will, and established the same form of governance that China has had for the last, well, almost 2,000 years at this point, which is an imperial dynasty. And he retains the large bureaucracy that the Qing had created. And we have talked about this word bureaucracy in class. It refers to government and different government bureaus, if you will, B-U-R-E-A-U-S. Sorry, I had to spell that out loud so that I could get it right. But bureaus are departments. And so each bureau is staffed with government officials, if you will, bureaucrats, right? People who work for those bureaus. And they represent different departments that deal with different aspects of the country, of governing the country. So in our particular country, in the United States, we have different departments like the State Department, we have the Department of Education, we have the Department of Commerce, we have the, various departments in that way. And each department has its own employees, which means a huge government structure. And so the Han Dynasty retains that large, very centralized, very powerful bureaucracy that was established by the Qin. What is different about the Han is this word right here, as you can see it, meritocracy. A meritocracy, and you may notice the two words that go together, merit at the beginning and ocracy at the end, and it might remind you of democracy. So ocracy is sort of a form of government, and merit, again, the idea here is that candidates who staffed the government were chosen for their merit, which if you don't know what the word merit means, it means ability or talent or intelligence or, something like that. So the novel idea here is that government employees, bureaucrats, if you will, were chosen for their abilities, not necessarily their family connections. And there's a lot of good and a lot of ill dealing with this. So up until this point, most government officials were chosen based on their family connections. And that just stands to reason. If I'm a king and there's lots of powerful lords out there who own a lot of land, then obviously I want to keep the lords close to me. I want them to like me. I'm going to employ them or their sons in my government. It just makes sense. But here in China, we see something new, a departure from that concept where, God forbid, the concept is, wow, we want government employees to be intelligent and to be able and to have these abilities, that they're actually competent officials. And so, although a civil service exam, the formal exam that we'll see later on in history in China, doesn't necessarily develop in its final stages during the Han Dynasty, an early exam begins during this era to try to weed out the smart from the not so smart, the able from the not so able. And so that's where you see this whole civil service examination. Bureaucrats are sometimes also called civil servants. They are government employees. And what starts here in China is a kind of a rudimentary exam, again, to weed out those who are able and not able, or smart and not so smart. They want candidates, they want employees who know their Confucius readings. As you can see, that these exams were based on Confucian ideas, and we're going to talk more on that later. But the civil service exam is something that began in China and has been co-opted by many countries around the world. In fact, the United States has a variety of civil service exams that government employees have to pass in order to be employed by the government. For example, if you want to be a letter carrier or an employee of the post office, you must pass a civil service exam. So in general, the treatment of people during the Han Dynasty was much better than during the Qin. The Qin was subscribed to legalism and thus was very rigid and very punitive. They imposed very harsh punishments on people, and it left people living in scared, essentially, living in terror of disrupting the laws or breaking the laws and something like that. So the Han Dynasty was a relief for most people. What they did leave in place, as you can see here, is some Qin ideas, not necessarily legalism itself. They revoked a lot of the laws and many of the punishments, but the idea that the state is supreme, the authority of the state and the structure of that bureaucracy, as I mentioned, the power of the central government. Liu Bang liked that. And he liked the concept that his government was supreme over a wide variety of territory. And so he left that particular idea in place. That appealed to him, for sure. What he didn't like was legalism. And so he is going to adopt Confucian ideas of government. The concept that there are a lot of Confucian concepts which will be studied in the next unit more specifically and more in depth. But for this particular unit, the Confucian ideas that he adopts are the ideas, number one, that there are certain relationships in Chinese society where you have a superior figure and an inferior figure, like a father and a son, an older brother and a younger brother, a ruler and his people. And the relationship between these two figures, the superior and the inferior, is supposed to be synergistic, meaning they work together for a greater good. But they both have very specific roles, and they're both supposed to respect each other. The inferior is supposed to respect and obey the superior, which is what appeals to Liu Bang and the Han Dynasty rulers in general, the emperors, which is that, as the superior figure, their inferior figures, the people in China, are supposed to obey them. That's attractive. The superior figure, however, has a responsibility to the inferiors, and so they are supposed to set a good example. They're supposed to lead by, moral behavior. They're supposed to lead virtuously. They're supposed to illustrate the way that the inferior figure should live. So there is a responsibility upon the emperors of China in that way. The other aspect of Confucianism that we see here is a complete rejection of legalism. In the primary source that we read in class, Confucius talks about how with so many laws, people will not necessarily obey laws, and with the more laws there are, the more people are inclined to break them and not even feel bad about breaking them. But with less laws and more leadership, if you will, moral leadership, then people will feel inspired to be virtuous. And so, thus, the Han Dynasty adopts Confucianism, and it's at this point that China officially becomes a Confucian state, and it's a state that they will never leave. Even today, there are many underpinnings of even communist China that are Confucian. And we'll talk a little bit more as we go throughout this year and next year how Confucianism and communism actually blend very well together. Now, the maintenance of empire is, of course, the most difficult, and we've talked about this before. And much of maintenance of empire goes to maintenance of economy. Because when people are prosperous, when people are fat and happy, then they don't want to overthrow the government. Who would want to overthrow a government that's making me rich? Exactly, you don't. So you only want to overthrow the government when economic times are tough. So a lot of maintenance of empire goes to creating infrastructure and promoting trade, if you haven't already gotten that from these series of videos. So in terms of the Han Dynasty, the government is going to seize control of the most lucrative, meaning the most prosperous or wealthy industries in China, which is salt mining, iron production, and coin minting. We've talked before about the importance of minting common coins throughout the empire because that facilitates and promotes trade. Salt mining, salt of course is very important in ancient times because of its ability to preserve meat in particular. Meat is very valuable and it doesn't last long if it's not put in a refrigerator or a freezer. And who in these eras has refrigerators or freezers? Exactly. So salt becomes very valuable, very important. Iron is important because it yields tools. And in particular, since 90-something plus percentage of the population are peasants, and they need iron tools in order to, I dare say, hoe the ground and, plow the ground and harvest their crops. They need iron implements. So these are the three most important industries, and the government is going to seize control of them and regulate them. The other big one that the government is going to tightly regulate and control is the silk industry. And my goodness, of all the industries, that is the most important and the most lucrative. In fact, in this era, silk was worth its weight in gold. And I don't know what the cost of gold is right now. It was up over $1,000 per ounce. So there's 16 ounces in a pound. You can imagine exactly the cost of silk in this era. Very expensive. And here we have a picture of silkworms as well as silk cocoons. In fact, it was considered so important that the penalty was death to anyone who shared the secret of silk making or who dared to smuggle silkworms out of China. So they took their silk production very seriously because they essentially had a monopoly. Everyone had to come to China to get silk. And thus trade becomes incredibly important. And it's during this time, during the Han Dynasty, that overland routes develop in Eurasia between China, the Far East, and the Middle East, and ultimately on to Rome. They're known as the Silk Roads because the most important product that traveled along these roads was silk. And in fact, trade was considered so important by the Han Dynasty that they're going to extend the Great Wall to protect these traders. There's a huge desert out to the sort of, northwest of where most of the Han civilization was. It's called the Taklamakan Desert, and traders would have to go around the Taklamakan Desert, and so the Han Dynasty actually built another 2,200 miles. That's right, 2,200 miles of Great Wall in order to protect those traders that were going to the north of the Taklamakan Desert. That's how important it was for them. But sadly, my friends, all good things must come to an end. And in fact, the Han Dynasty met its end in, 228 CE. And there were a lot of internal factors that led to its dissolution, that weakened this particular dynasty. Government corruption being one thing. We'll see a lot of correlation between the decline of the Han Dynasty and the decline of the Roman Empire. But government corruption is one problem. Huge taxes. Unfortunately, over time, the Han Empire or the Han Dynasty had to raise taxes. And a lot of the reason for the fact that they had to raise taxes is right here. That people started to refuse to serve in the army. So the quality of the army declines because they have to hire mercenaries. And so hiring mercenaries is expensive, number one. So therefore you have to raise taxes in order to raise money to hire those mercenaries. But also the quality of your army is going to decline because mercenaries are loyal to one thing, and that's gold or their payment. They're not necessarily loyal to the Han Dynasty. So as there are increased attacks by the Xiongnu, and the Xiongnu are the pastoral people to the north of the Han Empire, as you can see here. They're not a kingdom. They're groups of pastoral people. Alternately, they're called Huns or Mongols. The Xiongnu are another group, and they would continually attack the Han Dynasty, and as they experienced greater and greater success because the quality of the army declined because the Han Dynasty was using mercenaries and thus having to raise taxes. More and more peasants became disgruntled with their particular government. And as I mentioned before, the best way to maintain your empire is to keep people fat and happy. And so people are not fat and happy anymore. They're not economically prosperous. Peasants are upset. They begin rebellions. And that leads to the rise of local warlords, which is a big continual problem in Chinese history. Local lords. So you have a central government, but you have lords ruling various regions. And so as the central government appears weaker and weaker, these lords sense that the end of the mandate is near. And it's time to maybe rise up and rebel against it. And perhaps the local warlord could become the next dynastic ruler. Who knows? So ultimately, the Han Dynasty disintegrates just like the Zhou did and the Qin did into a certain degree of civil war. And that is going to lead to the end of the Han Dynasty. If you would, go ahead and take a minute and interact with your notes, star, circle, underline, define terms, whatever it is, and interact with the notes in the left-hand column, if you will, and write a short summary at the bottom. Thanks so much.